Welcome everybody to Great Decisions 2022 for this day on January 26, 2022. I will be today. Our presenter will be from the University of Texas at Tyler, historian Colin Snyder, talking about the drug war in Latin America and beyond. First, I am your host, Jeffrey Green, and I will be from Tyler Junior College. First, some notes. The Great Decisions Lecture Series is sponsored by the following organizations: the AAUW, the American Association of University Women of Tyler, an organization dedicated to the advancement of gender equity for women and girls through research, education, and advocacy, as well as the League of Women Voters of Tyler-Smith County, a nonpartisan voter education and advocacy organization whose mission is to educate, register, and ultimately get citizens of Smith County to the polls, educated and prepared to make informed decisions. The Tyler Public Library, where we currently are, and the National Foreign Policy Association, from which the topics are chosen for discussion groups like ours all over the United States. The Smith County Discussion Group has been ongoing for over 30 years. Colin Snyder is an assistant professor of Latin American history at the University of Texas, Tyler, with a PhD in Latin American history from the University of New Mexico. His work specializes in social movements, higher education, military regimes, state-society relations, and human rights and memory in Latin America, with a specific focus on Brazil. He has published articles, numerous articles and book chapters on the subjects of higher education, student movements, and transitional politics in Brazil. He is currently at work on a book manuscript that uses the Brazilian university system to examine the ways in which the middle class in Brazil played an increasingly central role in defining the political and social struggles of Brazil in the 20th century. And on a personal note, I first presented at Great Decisions in February of 2020, just before everything shut down. And when I got the call to present, I wanted to see how these things went, how you do it. And so I came here in mid-January, about 2 years ago at this time, and the person I saw speaking was none other than Professor Colin Snyder, and at that time on China and Latin America. And from him I kind of learned how you do it, and I basically based the formats for my presentations that year and last year and this year on what Professor Snyder did on that particular day. So if you like my presentations, you will probably love Professor Snyder's. And with that, I will introduce Colin Snyder.
And if you didn't like his presentations, I had nothing to do with it. Hey, God. Yes, I was just thinking, boy, last time I was in here was a little more crowded. There was something out there that we knew about, but it had not yet arrived. So that was a lifetime ago, but it's good to be back in the library and speaking to you all. So yes, I have done a couple of these before. And this year when it came up with the topic, I thought, well, this is going to be just all kinds of I hope they don't have questions. What's the solution? I don't know. We've got 40 plus years of failed policies here. So what I would like to do today to sort of speak to the question of drug policy in Latin America is just approach it from sort of two different perspectives. On the one hand, U.S. policy regarding the drug trade, which if I can put the cart before the horse, we now know is pretty much 40 to 50 years of failed policies. And we know that in part because of the other thing I'd like to emphasize, which is sort of the nature of drug production, the marketing of it, the shifting landscape of it, and sort of how it responds in real time to the ideals that policies speak out to. And then at the end, we'll sort of wrap up with some, not just some, here's all the things that haven't worked, but possible paths forward and the limitations or potentials of each. And when we're talking about the drug trade in Latin America, we're, especially by the late 20th century, we're dealing primarily with cocaine. That there had been marijuana trafficking, and we'll turn to that here shortly. But there's an increasing demand for the drug at the global level, and so it's largely centered on exporting drug manufacturing in Latin America to the United States and to Europe, which are wealthier markets. On the domestic front, U.S. policymakers historically have tried to reduce American drug use through two fashions. Using the criminal justice system at home to coerce and punish people who use or sell drugs, and this is referred to as demand reduction. And then the flip side, the sort of other side of that coin is the supply reduction, which on the international front has hinged upon sponsoring military and police efforts to combat production and export of illegal drugs from other countries. And I really like the way that the piece for this year, they sort of, I'm going to quote from it, but they ask, have harsh drug control policies caused more harm than good? and continue that the issue of migration to the United States from Latin America has overshadowed the war on drugs, which has been underway for decades with little signs of progress. What are the roots of the bureaucratic logic behind today's dominant drug policies in Latin America? Is it time to reconsider punitive drug policies that disrupt supply chains and punish drug possession? And I think the answer to the two questions posed about have they caused more harm than good, and is it time to reconsider approaches? The answer is a qualified yes. That much like our foreign policy in other arenas, and I remember a few years ago I spoke to US-Cuban relations, that if you keep trying the same thing for decades with no change in outcome, from the historian's perspective, it would suggest the time to at least try to maybe modify those policies, and if it doesn't work out with the new ones, you can go back to the old ones, you know how. And so to sort of begin to approach this subject, we really need to start with, on the US side, Nixon. Right, it's with Richard Nixon that you get the first open declaration of the war on drugs in 1971, that he announced it as such, and it was originally meant to target marijuana and heroin, which were the primary boutique drugs of the time. And he sort of associates marijuana with hippies and heroin with African Americans in the cities. And with this war on drug, you get new laws that are designed to create harsh punishments for the use and dealing of such drugs. You get the creation of the Drug Enforcement Agency in 1973, and it immediately sees the expenses of this, right? That the US drug control budget goes from $66.4 million in 1969 to $1 billion by 1973. And Washington continues to look south of the US border for solutions to crack down on this, what it envisions as the US's drug habit. This sort of appeals to stereotypes of Mexican drug lords as unprincipled exploiters of American youth, and it really harkens back to even earlier visions of drug trade from the 1930s to the 1950s. And this war on drugs really does sort of target, and it's temporarily successful, depending on how you measure it. Because the aim was really to sort of like, all right, we need to eradicate the production of marijuana in Mexico and heroin from Turkey. And so the drug policies overseas really emphasize just wipe out those crops and stop them from coming here. And it works in eliminating the marijuana trade, or reducing greatly the marijuana trade in Mexico and the Turkish heroin trade. But there's still demand, right? This really speaks to much of US foreign policy, is a sort of perversion of supply-demand economics, where our foreign policy has focused strictly on the supply without really reconciling itself to the issue of the demand within the borders of the United States. And so while you managed to wipe out heroin production in Mexico, or Turkey, and marijuana in Mexico, Colombia begins to produce marijuana, and Mexico begins to produce heroin, right? They eliminate those places, which leads to the industry relocating elsewhere. Additionally, by the early 80s, you see sort of the second war on drugs launched under Ronald Reagan, which expanded penalties for marijuana. It established minimum sentencing guidelines and established civil forfeiture procedures for those connected to the drug trade. But the criminalization efforts under Reagan are going to target in particular a relatively new drug, and that is crack cocaine. And it really sort of speaks to the, and again, I say this is not nothing from today, is from any particular political spectrum, but just from what we as historians acknowledge. It's a pretty unequal application of the law. So these minimum sentencing guidelines, we now know through both declassified documents and documents made public at the time, really go after inner city African Americans and the poor African American community, which is the large user of cocaine or crack cocaine. So that the penalties for crack cocaine were triple the penalties for cocaine. And the only difference was, to sort of put this in a very simple geographic stereotype, cocaine was on Wall Street, crack cocaine was in Harlem, right? So that the minimum mandatory sentencing was triple for crack cocaine than it was for cocaine, even though both were equally lethal and equally addictive. You also see, and this is through some, including declassified documents we have now, they choose to ignore crystal amphetamines, even though they knew at the time that's also becoming a major problem, but it was affecting rural white communities. And so you don't see these minimum sentencing guidelines, that they sort of actively make this choice. And so you see this active targeting of some efforts at the drug policy, but it's not a comprehensive vision across all elements of drug use and abuse in the country. You also see, again, the further escalation of federal spending on drugs, so that the FBI's anti-drug enforcement units went from $8 million of funding per year in 1980 to $95 million in 1984. Like, what about the other billions? Well, like, at that point, you already have the DEA, right? So this is just the FBI's funding. That same year, and sort of to speak to the inconsistency of policies, in 1982, Vice President Bush, who had been head of the CIA, pushes Reagan to really get the CIA and the military involved in these eradication efforts. But we now know, and we even knew by the late 80s through congressional hearings, the CIA doesn't necessarily target all eradicators. That the CIA does not, as far as we know to this present, does not pump crack directly into the cities. But it's aiding the Contras in Nicaragua during the 1980s and the Sandinista wars. And we know that it knows the Contras were making their money by selling and trafficking in cocaine, sending it to the US, and the CIA just sort of turns a blind eye to that activities because it's focused on getting rid of the Sandinistas. As a result, Latin America is growing increasingly frustrated with the war on drugs, or at least parts of it are. In part, not necessarily on the principle, because they're not being helped, and I'll come back to them here in just a second, but they're not being aided by the existence of the drug trafficking networks, far from it. But the problem is, especially in these early years, they sort of see US policy as hypocritical, because it's pushing them to do all these things. They say, you gotta quit the supply, you gotta quit the supply, and their response is, we weren't supplying until your part started demanding. And you see that especially in cocaine, that there's almost no market for cocaine as late as the early 1970s. It's not one of those big international drugs. It's not heavily in use in the United States, except in one exception. Of course, cocaine itself comes from a plant. It's a natural plant, the coca plant, which is just a leaf. It's like tea. I've actually, not in this country because it's illegal, but I've had coca tea because it's just, do you have any coffee? No. Do you have anything? Because I kind of need to wake up. We have coca tea? All right. Sure, and it's just a cup of tea that wakes you up. And it goes back to before the Europeans arrived. There was this plant that indigenous peoples would just chew on while they were working to sort of stay alert and awake. And there's not really a market for it. And the leaf itself, the thing I always tell students in class is, coca leaf is to cocaine as poppy seeds are to heroin. Like, you're not just going to go like eat one and test positive for drugs. The one place you do see coca leaf in the United States is Coca-Cola. That it was made from a coca leaf, and we don't know, it might still be made from coca leaf because they developed merchandise number 5 syrup. That's their secret ingredient for Coca-Cola that had coca leaf in it, and it's still secret. So I don't know, something makes it tasty, but it's just the leaf still, right? It's not like, oh, Coca-Cola is made of cocaine. No, it's not. Is made of coca leaf. But beginning in the late 1960s and 1970s, American youths traveling through Latin America encounter cocaine, which leads to a growth in its market. So by 1977, 10% of young Americans had tried cocaine. By the mid-1980s, 22 million Americans have admitted to trying cocaine. But this leads to the paradox of crackdown too, because the United States sees a problem and says, we got to crack down on this. The moment it's rendered illegal, to a different element of the supply and demand, if you cut off and make the supply more difficult, the value skyrockets. And because it's illegal, it's not going to attract on the up businessmen, it's attracting criminal organizations. And so you see this, and sort of paradoxically increases greater demand for the item then. It's hard to come by. Well, I must have it now. If they don't want me to have it, I should have it. And so you get the paradox of crackdown policies, which is trying to eliminate them, increases their demand and their profitability. And you really see that in Latin America in the 1980s, so starting even in the late 1970s. And in part, this taps into social conditions in the area. That you have plenty of poor peasant farmers who've been basically, like, just the class inequalities go back to colonial times. And they can farm to eke out a living. And you could farm papaya or rice or other products, but oftentimes you're so remote that by the time you get it to market, it's no good anymore. And it doesn't pay that well. And all of a sudden, here comes the market, well, if you just grow this plant for us, we'll buy it off you at really high prices. And so you start to see, like, it basically the failure to provide for the agricultural people in places like Bolivia, Peru, makes this feasible for them to feed their families. And it's those areas in part because the coca plant grows especially well. There's a part of Bolivia, in particular the province of Chapare, where the ground is so conducive to growing the coca plant that you could get 4 harvests in a season. And so that ability, the wealth it provides for people in Latin America, combined with the growing demand and illegalization of it on the US side, that leads to increasing value, makes that just a far more feasible effort, or far more feasible means to support your families. And to be clear, those who are farming it in Bolivia, Peru, and even later in Colombia, they're not really involved in the cocaine production itself. That cocaine is produced in a 3-step process. First, you farm the coca leaf, then it's turned into a paste, and then it's chemically refined. And it's in that 3rd step that it becomes cocaine. That typically happened in Colombia, not in Peru and Bolivia. And so you have these farmers who are basically, it'd be the equivalent of, I can't even think of a good equivalent, blaming a corn farmer for diabetes. He's not the one turning it into corn syrup and pumping it into all the food. He's growing it because it's what makes his family the most money for where he lives. And so you see Bolivian processors buying, or you see farmers farm it, they sell it to Bolivian processors or Peruvian processors later who turn it into a paste, who then sell it to Colombians who turn it into the drug and sell it in the United States. And it's going to be primarily Bolivia and Peru that dominate the production of the leaf in the 80s. It'll eventually move to Colombia in the 90s for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, it's more profitable for the traffickers if they just make it themselves. But also Bolivia and Peru, at the US's behest, begin to crack down on eradicating it. And this leads to that balloon effect. We already saw it once when all of a sudden marijuana went from Mexico to Colombia. Now cocaine and coca leaf is going to go from Peru and Bolivia to Colombia because it's not a comprehensive policy. You tell individual countries, hey, you're producing it, so we need you to crack down on it. This leads the producers to go elsewhere to continue producing it and make profits. And in fact, there's even, early in the 80s, Bolivia has a very short military dictatorship that's referred to as the cocaine dictatorship because of its sort of profiting off of this early trade. This means that by the early 90s, Colombia really is the center of almost all cocaine production and exportation. But this is when you get your famous cartels, your Pablo Escobars, who just come off as, they often enjoy the support of the public. They're not actually Robin Hoods, but they portray themselves as such because they're using this incredible profit to reinvest in the community through things like schools, parks, etc., not out of their goodness of their heart, but if the majority of the public supports you, it's harder for the politicians to come after you. And so you'll have these sort of scenarios. Of course, ultimately Escobar is captured. He still continues running his operations out of his own prison, so ultimately he's eventually killed while trying to flee, he was trying to flee. But that doesn't really halt the trade, right? If anything, and this again, is sort of the unintended consequences of drug policies. He's the head of the Medellin cartel. We got him. He's gone. That's the end of the Medellin cartel. The Cali cartel is eager to pick up the profits. So they are operating, but then they're cracked down on. But by this time, the transportation networks have spread beyond national borders once again. So that by the late 1990s, it's made its way into Mexico and Central America because the US's efforts had been focused on one, there have been sort of 2 historical efforts to control the flow of drugs into the United States. The first that we turned to originally is the word just totally escaped my mind. Interdiction, there we go. Catch it at the borders. So in the 90s, you had like the Medellin cartel just flights into Miami, boats straight into Florida to get the cocaine in the United States, and it goes out from there. As the US gets wise to this, they start to turn to Mexican traffickers who can get it along a far larger, more porous border. So this brings in other agents to be involved in the process. And of course, cocaine, because it's illegal and expensive, and especially in its non-crack form, it's only cheaper in crack cocaine because it's got baking soda in it, but it's, like I said, equally devastating. But cocaine itself, very valuable in terms of the money it generates. But that's wealth that's off the books. And it's profit generating enough that Forbes magazine estimated in the early 90s that Pablo Escobar was one of the 10 richest people in the world. With it off the books, it certainly provides employment, perhaps for as many as 500,000 people in Colombia alone, but only a small portion of those profits trickle down into the community or amongst the workers. It tends to remain in the hands of a few who can then use it to buy off people, corruption, bribery, extortion, etc. And this gets us then into the 2000s, where you sort of see this escalation of violence and sort of the failures of anti-drug policies and the unintended consequences of US policy. So that in response to Colombia continuing to have, we thought we'd won the cocaine war on drugs with Escobar's death. And then it turns out we have not, and it's still coming into the country. So in 1998 and 1999, the United States and Colombia work at a $1.3 billion program called Plan Colombia. It's an aid package offered to provide a multifaceted strategy to facilitate peace, revive economic development, combat drug trafficking, and strengthen democratic pillars, which sounds great. Multiple levels, try to really, don't just deal with this as a drug issue, but this is a social issue. Development, maybe the farmers can have better things to turn to. But almost all of the money goes to military. It focuses on that eradication part. That over $800 million alone goes to the military. It's only $900 million for everything else. Democratic pillars, social support networks, economic programs. And so what this does is it not just doesn't offer the comprehensive vision and first suggested, but it also makes the military an increasingly important actor in politics, right? This sort of undermines institutions of democracy, that the more powerful and autonomous the military gets in any situation, the more likely you are towards a destabilized or at least a weakened democracy. Additionally, it's creating an entire bureaucracy of the war on drugs. So if you say, well, we're not going to do that anymore, you've got entire governmental offices there and here. What are you going to do for them for jobs now? And you think they're just going to, give up the ghost, well, we had a good run. Guess we'll just be unemployed now. And so you see, Plan Colombia might have been well-intentioned in terms of at least offering a broader approach to the war on drugs, but in practice it doesn't really accomplish that. And it does lead, again, unintended consequences. It leads those Colombian dealers to then turn more and more to Central America, to Mexico, to help get it into the United States that way. And so that by the 2000s, the production's in Colombia, the transportation's in Mexico. And this allows cartels to control the market and therefore effectively the whole industry. So the US has once again put all this pressure on Colombia. Like earlier, we put pressure on Peru and Bolivia to crack down. That just led it to shift to Colombia. Put the pressure on Colombia, Mexico is once again entering the scene. This is where you get that violence. And again, the profits by this point, $8 to $24 billion a year in cocaine. And this is where we get to the violence that sort of often showed up on television screens in the late 2000s and early 2010s, because the Mexican president, Felipe Calderón, decides we're going to end this right now. So he puts a lot of military efforts to cracking down on the cartels, but this leads to incredible bloodshed. And again, the money and its power in weakening institutions can't be here, because the cartels have a lot of money. Well, we'll get the police on them. They've bought the police. They pay the police better than you do. So the police force is not going to crack down on them. The police force is working for them. Well, we'll send in the army. Okay, but now it's the army versus the police and the drug lords. And even when there were successes, it only made matters worse in some regards, because originally there were only 7 cartels in Mexico that were really involved in these networks. They get rid of the 7 cartels. They splinter into 60 different local groups that aren't just now competing, they're not just continuing it at the local level and continuing to buy out institutions or politicians. They're also fighting one another now. So that you have multiple layers of violence and devastation in Mexico. On the one hand, the state versus cartels, but also cartels versus cartels. And this is why you're getting all these civilians that you see in the news stories that would be killed and just dozens of bodies dumped in the street. That there was the disappearance of 43 students in Mexico about 9 years ago. They were going to the Mexico City to protest demanding more funding for education. They just went missing. They still haven't found them. I think they found the remains of one body. They'd hijacked some buses that were just public buses. Didn't realize the buses were involved, tied to one of the cartels who bought out one of the local politicians. And so they were It wasn't the government crackdown on them. It was the drug company that's like, can't have this. And so this is what, and this is how the drug trade then in Latin America, especially in Colombia too, right? That they had a civil war for over 50 years, and by the 90s, right-wing paramilitary groups were actively involved in trafficking because it was profitable. The leftist guerrillas weren't as active in trafficking, but they were willing to look the other way on it. They weren't directly profiting from it, but they often would run sort of protection rackets for the areas of growing coca leaf. And so this affects all of population. That Colombia had an internally displaced population of millions. Mexico, also hit by this. Central America, in the triangle of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Drug lords there, right? It's sort of, you get these gangs forming, they begin their own protection rackets. And so this leads us up to the present, and sort of a moment of assessment as prompted by the decision makers of great decisions this year. And that's the impact of the war on drugs up to this moment. Again, the role of the military throughout Latin America has continuously expanded. Conflicts around trafficking, both between the state and traffickers and amongst traffickers themselves, have intensified. Drug-related violence has escalated throughout the region. The incredible wealth of this illicit trade and the lack of regulation of that wealth has led to criminal organizations with the ability to infiltrate and or dominate government institutions across the region. And widespread violence has led to displaced populations, again, first internally, but increasingly in the form of immigration. If foreign policy sort of started off by saying, oh, the issue of immigration has really occupied America's attention, but the drug issues, they're not different. Because an overwhelming majority of those people who are fleeing are doing so because of the violence brought about in their home countries because of the drug trade, right? That one leads to the other. The violence and instability at home caused by drug violence leads to people seeking a safer haven where it doesn't exist as much, and they come here. I think by any definition of its original terms and metrics, the war on drugs has been a failure. Not out of any political preference, like, oh, this is what the war on drugs is going to do, and you go down the list like, well, no. The eradication campaigns of the 80s to 2000s failed to suppress production, trafficking, or consumption, so they didn't address supply or demand. Again, eradication may reduce production in one area, but in every instance where it occurred, it popped up in another area. So for instance, in the mid-1990s, the US led efforts in Peru and Bolivia that saw a drop of 66% of reduction of coca in Peru and a 53% reduction in coca in Bolivia, and cultivation at that time remained stagnant because it was picking up in Colombia. Also, these eradication efforts do nothing to address demand. You can wipe out as many fields as you want, but you're not doing anything about your users at home who are creating the market in the first place. And to be clear, and you see this in conversations internationally throughout the 80s, 90s, and even to the present, of, the sort of perverse supply and demand, where the United States is saying, it's all your fault for supplying, and Latin America saying, it's all your fault for demanding. Novel idea. Both are true, and both groups need to acknowledge as much. Additionally, eradication campaigns took a huge environmental toll because they're dropping herbicides that you're not supposed to, like Monsanto, right, that produces Roundup, created the herbicides to wipe out the coca plant. It's quite clear if you're exposed to this, for 14 days you need to do these things. It was regularly dropping it on people in the fields, on livestock, on chickens, leading to respiratory problems, skin rashes, vomiting, premature births, miscarriages amongst the people in these countries. To say nothing of even the production of cocaine itself has an enormous environmental toll, because you're using, among other things, hydrochloric acid to refine it. And then it just gets dumped into the rivers. Meanwhile, interdiction campaigns to catch drugs at the border have also largely failed, in part because we got some big borders. And it's not just the southern border. If anything, the Canadian border has been even easier to infiltrate because it's even less regulated. You also have constantly improving tactics by profit-driven drug smugglers. So making the efforts to find illegal drugs at the border is like trying to find a very small needle in a huge haystack. No, it's not just the 2,000 miles of the US-Mexico border. It's not even just the US-Canada border. It's 12,000 miles of shoreline. It's 300 ports of entry. Optimistic estimates suggested that interdiction manages to seize 10 to 15% of heroin and 30% of cocaine coming in the United States. And that's the optimistic estimate. That 3 out of 10, 30% we get. Additionally, interdiction efforts have led to production of more potent forms of the drug that proved to be more lethal. Meanwhile, as I've mentioned before, the focus on supply at the source and interdiction came at the expense of demand reduction and public health strategies in the United States. That there was never an effort to really halt efforts at drug use in the United States. The only effort we had were those criminal penalties under Nixon and then Reagan, where we'll make you stop using drugs by just throwing you in jail for doing it. And even there, sometimes the absurdity of the policies could be visible, where you had extradition of guys importing thousands of tons of cocaine into the United States. Colombia extradited them. The average prison sentence they served in the United States was 10 years. But the average prison sentence for somebody dealing in an ounce or less of crack cocaine was 12 years. So even a complete disproportion, like, what'd you do? I sold an ounce of crack. How long are you in for? 12 years. What'd you do? I sold 487 tons last year. What about you? 10. Where there's just these very unequal structures of penalization that don't really address the issue. And I'm not saying just let them all free, but that's not a particularly effective deterrent to addressing the demand side of issues. Even Plan Colombia, and then we have another version of it with Mexico later, the Plan Merida, which was similar to Plan Colombia, but just aid to Mexico. That money overwhelmingly goes to armed forces and doesn't necessarily do anything to address the question of demand or counter the form of supply. So the question then remains what to do about this. That if we have these years, decades of policies that have not been particularly effective in what they set out to do, well, what do we do? There's certainly the question of legalization, and many have seen this as a magic bullet, and it isn't. And the idea that you just abolish the laws against sale, possession, or consumption of drugs, submit it to laissez-faire competition, and the traffickers will be forced out of business, because if you open up the market, prices will drop, states can regulate the quality of stuff being produced, treat it like alcohol, fine. And that draws the support from the American right and the American left, albeit for very different reasons. But the issue is not as simple as that, because there's four main questions plaguing the question of legalization. Which drugs? All of them? Some of them? If you're only going to legalize some of them, and there seems to be growing consensus in this country, like, oh, okay, well, marijuana, fine. All right, but the problem hasn't been that one. The cocaine trafficking has been the one that's been so devastating. Like, it's not marijuana trafficking that led to the growing violence in Central America and Mexico in the 90s and 2000s. What consumers? Who is it legalized for? Is there an age limit? How do you regulate that? I don't know if things have changed, but when I was in high school, oh, that's illegal. Well, you're doing a bang up job on preventing people from using stuff. Let me tell you, there's definitely no alcohol use amongst teenagers in high school. Never. What means of distribution if you legalize it? Local retail outlets? Government stores like some states have for liquor? And what kinds of prices and taxes? Because it would be necessary to minimize black market sales. At the same time, though, hefty taxes, and we see this in Colorado, right? That when they legalized it, everyone is thrilled. And the sales tax was 20%, which was brilliant for Colorado. Use that for public, put that money elsewhere for the public. So on inspection, it became clear that most proposals for legalization envisioned not the legalization of the status quo, but some form of regulation, which again runs into its own challenges. Because at the federal level, the government still says, nope, it's all illegal. And some politicians have made their name on being tough on drugs. So that you sort of face these different kinds of institutional challenges. Again, marijuana is where the most headway has been made on this topic. Essentially, it has the same rules as alcohol. There's a legal age limit. You shouldn't be doing certain things while under its influence, and if you are, you can be penalized for that. we're not ahead of the curve on this one. We were a little bit behind, at least the states that have legalized it. So that in 2013, it's not here, it's not even in Europe, it's Uruguay in South America, who becomes the first country in the world to create a legal, regulated cannabis market. And it's quickly followed by Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela. And in the process, this led to another interesting unintentional consequence. Because for decades, the US had dictated policy internationally on drugs. What the US wanted and the money it pumped into fighting the drug trade meant that it was sort of the leader, the loudest voice in the room. But once all these other countries start to legalize marijuana, the US's influence on this question, it doesn't disappear, but it's no longer dominating the conversation. And they would sometimes take interesting paths. I was in Chile several years ago after it had been legalized, and you could grow it at home, and you could smoke it at home, but you weren't allowed to sell it. So you could get the plant, and I met somebody who did, and basically couldn't believe how much work it took. It's like, wow, this is not the reputation that usually fits weed smokers. He'd work on it for hours, just making sure the plants were in the right conditions to survive. And he couldn't sell it, but he wasn't. He just used it, he and his friends used it. You weren't supposed to use it in public either, but based on walking in the streets and the smells in the air, that was not necessarily followed to the letter of the law. Then internally in 2016, California voters approved legalization, followed by Colorado and Washington in 2018. Another possibility along the legalization route and in conjunction with it is a major shift in priorities, where we, instead of spending all of it on combating its production, shifting the funding to prevention and treatment processes and programs. Eliminate the incarceration for possession, at least of marijuana, and perhaps of other drugs in smaller scope, and intensify law enforcement efforts against money laundering and the sale of firearms to traffickers. Right? This is another proposal that's sort of, it's not of the legalization per se, but it ties in and directly through the idea of put the money elsewhere, like keep the money, but instead of giving a bunch of guns to people to go and chemicals to wipe out plants, treat people. Offer education, rehabilitation, instead of strict prohibitionism. In Latin America, use that money to strengthen the institutions of the state rather than focus on militaries and eradication programs. And these are just proposals, right? This is not what I'm advocating for one way or the other. The global market has also changed things significantly and has diversified them, if anything. The market for cocaine has dropped in the United States from 70% to 31% of the global demand between the mid-90s to the 2010s. Not because we're not on drugs anymore, but because the market for amphetamines and synthetic drugs increased, especially for fentanyl, which is 50 times more powerful than heroin. I saw when I was preparing this, like a picture of a penny, just a penny, and a tiny little white dot next to it. It's like that amount of fentanyl right there is lethal. And you could access this stuff easily in the United States by the 2000s, 2010s. You just needed a prescription. So part of the explanation for our drop in our cocaine usage was simply we found more legal ways to get drugs that could still be equally lethal, see the opioid crisis. And you have, again, unintended consequences. In the 1990s, Congress and Clinton signed off on a law, the Republican Congress and Bill Clinton signed off on a law that allowed pharmaceutical companies to do commercials on television. That's when we start to see the commercials for Cialis and Viagra and ask your doctor about this thing that has 17 side effects that are far worse than the thing you're actually dealing with. But that meant that people were learning about new drugs they could do and get legally and then abuse. Not that that was the intention. That was like, hey, free market. Ask your doctor about this medicine. But it led to the opioid crisis as there's profit in that. And we see families like the Sacklers make hundreds of millions and billions off of a crippling drug addiction amongst rural Americans. And just because we stop using doesn't mean others don't. It just leads to a shifting landscape. The market in Europe goes up, the market in Southeast Asia goes up, and domestic markets in Latin America go up. So that Brazil sees an escalation in its use and dealing of cocaine in ways it never had before in the 2000s and 2010s, because the dealers still want the traffickers still want the profits. They'll find new markets. And now you have violence in cities in Brazil where drug gangs in underrepresented, often ignored, marginalized poor neighborhoods, they basically run the neighborhood, and then the police come in and try to stop it. And you get these shootouts where 17 traffickers are killed, and the next day it turns out one of them was a 63-year-old lady at the grocery store, and one was a 5-year-old on their way to school, but they were all traffickers. And sometimes, again, back to what we saw in Mexico even. There's more money in that than in being in the police force. So the police get rid of the traffickers in the neighborhood and take over the trade on the side. This led to, in 2009, the Latin American Commission on Drugs and Democracy, which was co-chaired by 3 ex-presidents. Colombia's Cesar Gaviria, Mexico's Ernesto Zedillo, and Brazil's Fernando Henrique Cardoso, calling for a fundamental paradigm shift in which they said the war on drugs has failed. It has spawned violence, crime, and corruption. And that the long-term solution, I'm going to quote from them here, is to reduce drastically the demand for drugs in the main consumer countries, the United States and Europe. In 2011, the Global Commission on Drug Policy, a blue ribbon group that included former presidents or prime ministers of 5 countries, a former UN Secretary General, and business and government leaders, including George P. Shultz and Paul Volcker, recommended treatment rather than incarceration for those who use drugs and do no harm to others. They also recommended targeting international law enforcement efforts against criminal organizations rather than against nonviolent users. So instead of going after someone at home, blazing a joint, go after Escobar. In the US, we have seen an increasing move towards legalization. It's even been proposed in committee in the state of Texas, though it's never made it out of committee so far. There's also growing support in the public and amongst the politicians for treatment over penalization. Sometimes this is misconstrued, so when Oregon suggested legalizing heroin, there's like, they want everyone to die of heroin. No, Oregon's plan was legalize it so we know who's using it, we can monitor it and make sure they're not overdosing and that we're not sort of allowing this, which again, is not a plan I'm endorsing, right? But they're saying what you've been doing hasn't worked. We want to try this other way instead. Because people overdose because they are afraid they're doing it clandestinely. Maybe we can reduce the deaths from this if it's not clandestine. A 2020 report recommended that the United States establish a multi-year foreign assistance compact with ambassadors between in-country security and political leaders that would improve information sharing and focus more on building the structures of the states so it could better combat drug trades rather than just going after individual cartels and wiping out the production. All of these debates really hinge on a sort of dichotomy that's not everyone buys into this dichotomy, but is it public safety or do you focus on public health? And for the longest time, US policy on drugs was domestically, it's public safety. We'll throw in jail anybody who does it for the safety of the community. Right? Again, that Reagan calls it a national security threat. But they're increasingly beginning to explore the question of public health. And I think, if anything, in this country at least, the abuse of legal drugs, right, of pharmaceutically produced drugs in the last 20 years and sort of the epidemic that it caused, has forced the country to say, okay, it doesn't have to be a line of cocaine, 1970s rock style, for it to be a problem. And maybe we need to be focusing on the health issue. This is not to say advocates recommend abolishing training for police or destroying drug labs, quite the opposite, but that such efforts should be complemented by plans to improve public health, improve the lives of those overseas who get caught up in the production of coca leaf. Bolivia, fascinatingly, withdrew from the drug convention on cocaine in the 2000s, and the UN didn't condemn them for it. And by the UN, I don't mean like all the member nation states have to vote on whether you're out for violating this convention. It has to have at least 1/3. It couldn't even get that. Because Bolivia's argument was, the coca leaf is like, we're a majority minority population. We are mostly indigenous people. This has been a part of our culture since before Europeans ever set foot. Its growth is not the problem, and we are not the problem. Traffickers elsewhere, users elsewhere are the problem. This leaf itself is not a poison, and we're not going to crack down on those who grow it anymore. And interestingly, you see a great plummet in the production of cocaine from Bolivia. That because they sort of regulated the production of the leaf, It was used for ritual purposes, cultural purposes, everyday teas, and the problem of cocaine goes away. And so, to wrap up here, and I'll go ahead and open the floor to questions, but you can't control the supply without reducing the demand. And you can't curb demand without curbing supply. And the problem up to this point has been, we have been focused almost strictly on the supply side. And future paths going forward suggest that there needs to be more fine-tuned harmonization between those two components. Thank you. Now I'll open it to questions. Yes?
Do we know how to improve public health and keep people from doing drugs? Because in all the stuff I've watched, that's real hard to get them off. It takes 2 or 3 or 4 or more tries.
Yeah, and that's where, in part, one of the challenges, I mean, we do know how. The problem is resources then, right? Like sort of, and you run under some cultural issues. Like you can't just sort of lock somebody in rehab against their will. They still have the right to leave, because otherwise that's kidnapping. But a lot of advocates, and especially those who work in treatment, say basically, we don't have the resources where we can be continuous, like we don't either have enough beds for the people who need it, or we don't have enough money to have enough staff to help through this. So there has to be, in part, I think, a financial shift, or at least a reallocation, and a broader cultural shift that say, like, look, just because you're putting, let go of the individualism, you can't keep me here. Like, yes, they can, because it's for you and your family and others. So I think it sort of would require a little bit of more. It's more than just a matter of money. Yes, sir.
Can you describe the role of the Latin American drug cartels in the heroin and opiate trade?
Yes. So mostly, this is not trying to spur any hostilities. Mostly, like the same networks that proved conducive to getting the cocaine from Colombia into the United States. The heroin producers in Southeast Asia realized that those were pretty used. Like there's already a system in place. Let's turn to them. So Mexico also became a major route for heroin to enter the country, because they had those extant networks through cocaine, and then you have Asian traffickers sort of taking advantage of that system as well, which again just further pumped more money and destabilized the situation in Mexico further.
Why is it we can't get cat food and we can get cocaine? I mean, there's got to be a supply chain thing in here somewhere.
I think it comes back to illegality, right? Like the supply chain is caught up because there's not enough workers in the ports, there's not enough workers for the ships, so everything gets stuck. We all forget, but it's still affecting us. Remember the boat in the Suez Canal last year? Mm-hmm. That impact is still rippling out. But all of that's legal. So you have to go through those regulated markets in order to get the goods, get all the papers stamped, make sure everything's up to date. Because it's illegal, they don't have to do any of that. Find your person secretly, clandestinely along the coast or whatever, and just drop off the boat and flee. Also, and sort of the more glib, but not necessarily entirely wrong prospect or answer is, there's more profit in one than in the cat food. And if there's money to be involved, people will move quickly to make it move. Yes?
I understand that China does not have a drug problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is anyone caught dealing, they're gone.
Yeah.
They cut the supply.
Yes.
Right there.
Yeah.
Has that ever been discussed in our country?
It hasn't, I think in part because on the one hand, it's sort of, there's a couple of explanations here. On the one hand, it was really, the inequalities we come back to are sort of tricky, right? Because you would have your African-American dealer in Harlem getting hit hard, but the middle-class white guy giving some weed to a high school teenager was not facing the same penalties. So it was an unequal application of the law in ways that don't exist in China, really. Right, but so then the other issue then would be, I mean, China is just more authoritarian. I don't think that's a particularly radical declaration, as they're committing genocide against a particular ethnic group presently. So I think they just like when you look at the crackdown on Tiananmen Square, or all subsequent efforts to mention that it's just such a more regulated police state that they can do that and not face pushback because of the sheer single party power of the Communist Party in China, in ways that we culturally, because of our sort of sense of individual rights, we don't necessarily have that same cultural legal mindset. And the pushback it would receive because of, like, it could easily be opened up to partisan positioning then in ways that it can't in China.
You don't think that if that was incorporated in Harlem, Detroit, Philadelphia, Indianapolis, and about 5 to 20 of these people were killed, that might stop it?
I don't think so.
Colorado and Austin, Texas.
Yeah, I don't think it would, because for the same reason in some ways that we saw it not work in Colombia on a much larger scale, which is it just leads others to say, well, we can do it and get away with it. We'll find a way. And the sheer amount of money it will generate for me is worth the risk. Like, no one looked at Pablo Escobar's death and said, man, we got to quit producing cocaine. They said, market's open, baby. I think if it were to be effective, it would have to be like China, where just everybody all the time.
Right.
Full stop. And I don't think that would legally fly or culturally fly in this country because of the competition between parties and because of the much different, and I want to be clear, this is not sort of a one's better or worse, but just culturally this country's founding is predicated upon the rights of the individual in ways that the public itself would not tolerate. Like, they'd be real fine with that on some people until it affected them directly, and then all of a sudden there'd be an outrage.
Between parties, you said?
Yeah.
You mean Republicans and Democrats?
Yeah, like just whichever position one would take, the other one would then be able to sort of drum up outrage over it in a totally, like, I'm not picking one, I don't care who picks which side, but just because of the nature of electoral politics, I don't think you'd get that kind of agreement and unity across the party lines in this country, and that's a non-starter in China because there are no party lines. There's just the party line.
Well, the old saying, that's from venture, nothing gained.
Yeah, but the other issue too is just the federalized nature of this country, where there's not a federal law on it, so it leaves the states up to their own paths. So that if some states decide to do that, other states will just say, well, that's not what we're going to do. So yeah, I think it just, for any number of institutional, cultural, and political culture reasons in this country, I don't know that that would be effective. And the other thing too, this can't be known. China says they have none.
What?
China says they have no problem.
Oh, yeah.
But China controls the message it sends out to the world too. So do they really have no problem? Or do they tell us they have no problem and we have no way of knowing? I don't know the answer to that question, but it doesn't mean they definitely have solved it. It just means we can't say they haven't either. Yes, sir.
Do they have a level, maybe number of addictions and so forth, the people addicted to it or users or whatever in Latin America, as they seem to do here?
To which? To just in general?
Yes, in general, pick a.
No, but it's growing, in part because there's just no real efforts to spur domestic consumption in Latin America because it could demand so much more overseas. That's why they would target the U.S. and Europe, because like they'll just pay more for it.
So they have a supply chain in reverse down there.
No, but that's starting to change a bit, right? So that you've started to see it affect places like Rosario, Argentina has been hit hard by trafficking and the violence that surrounds it, Brazilian inner cities, and you're starting to see basically once the U.S. market started to dry up a bit, the producers sought new markets, and so you just sort of get it out there, let people get tried, get addicted, and sort of get your foothold that way. So in the 80s, no, it was not like it was here. Now it's growing. I don't have the exact data on a country-by-country basis, but I do know that you've seen growing internal domestic markets for cocaine. Like the internal domestic markets for cocaine within Latin American countries has gone up in the last several years, even as the U.S. market has gone down. Yes, sir.
As the baby boomers pass through the pipeline there, are the Generation X and Z picking up this drug habit, or did they not learn anything from us?
Not much. Why would it?
I think, well, in part, so there's a couple answers to this question. I think in part they learned, like, the marijuana seemed like a pretty overblown deal, and that doesn't seem so harmful. I can't channel those generations, but I think just the broader shift in consensus reflects that even the younger groups, like, what's the big deal? It's just
I was
marijuana.
thinking more about cocaine.
The harder ones, yeah, I think that's where the different timelines come in. Is like they're not looking at cocaine and thinking, oh, I got to stay away from that, or they're not watching Wolf of Wall Street saying, I got to try that. It's that there was this whole other world of drugs that developed around them, specifically through pharmaceuticals and other youthful drugs like ecstasy, thank you. That instead of, every generation is going to reject what its forebears did. But I don't think that any generation's like, I'm not going to do drugs because my parents' generation did. It's like, I'm not going to do those drugs are the drugs of my parents' generation. Ooh, what's this new fun thing over here? I don't know, I can't speak to younger generations. I still remember when I was in high school even, basically the drugs you saw people using were marijuana and prescription pills, abusing pills. I even had, at one point I had a friend who said, I tried cocaine. And we're like, what was that like? He said, just felt like I drank too much coffee. Well, if I want to feel like I drank too much coffee, I'll just drink too much coffee. We were not terribly enthused by it. So I don't know if it's led to less drug use. I think it might have led to different drug use. You don't hear a lot about LSD. You heard a lot about heroin when I was growing up, but not so much anymore. Or you do, but now it's in the sort of legalized opioid form rather than, and now there's fentanyl. Yes, sir?
Where does fentanyl fit into all these?
Where did it get them?
Fentanyl, where is it being?
China.
Yeah, it's being imported from Asia, yeah.
That's what I do, but none of that's coming to any great extent down through from Latin America up here?
No, not fentanyl. Nope. If it is, it's that just that pipeline to this hemisphere and then across the border. But yeah, that's the only drugs you ever really saw produced in Latin America for American consumption were marijuana historically, and then cocaine. Any other questions? Yes.
You didn't mention anything about a regular gang like MS-13, and didn't they play, or aren't they playing a role in the triangle?
Yes, absolutely.
What's that role like?
I'm sorry?
What kind of role are they playing?
So this is where it gets really interesting, and this is why I said drug policy and immigration policy can't necessarily be separated, because in the 1980s, the U.S. is there's a civil war in El Salvador. The U.S. is supporting the military, which sort of represents elite interests at the time, so coffee growing. It's a little more complicated than this, but there's sort of a conservative right and a socialist left. In our Cold War political worldview, we're supporting the right, which is the military. But the violence that it generates, it's 72,000 dead or so, or 75,000 dead in about 12 years. It's not quite on scale of Guatemala, but it's pretty bad. So you get this wave of Salvadoran immigration to the United States, often illegally or undocumentedly, because we wouldn't accept them as war refugees because we didn't recognize it as a war. So they often ended up in Los Angeles, Salvadorans did, and you sort of get this enclave. And there were other gangs already in El Salvador, in Los Angeles and in California. So this enclave sort of forms their own to protect their own. Like if they're going to come after us if we don't form one too. So that's where MS-13 actually originates. It's a Salvadoran gang born in the United States. And then we deport them. And what we've done is we just set the entire gang infrastructure to a place with even less regulation and government oversight, and they flourish. And that's where they get involved in the trafficking, and that's up to the present. That's where a lot of that violence sort of is leading to this immigration wave again. So that they come here, form gangs, we export them, or deport them. They get in where the money is there, and it prompts a different wave of migration back to the United States. Does that answer your question? Yes, sir.
One more. If we ever reach the point to where we don't have to use the mask, I'd like for you to come back and do some more so we can hear you.
Sure. Was that hard to hear? Was that hard? Okay.
It's hard.
Yeah, I was going to take it off, but I was like, I'm talking for 45 minutes and I'm around college students, so God knows if I've tested negative, but I don't know. May I go home tonight and
Last question.
Yes.
How is our experience with alcohol, the attempt of alcohol prohibition inform current policy? And what makes alcohol use socially acceptable versus
I don't think alcohol prohibition informs our current policy because we're so focused on prohibition, right? If anything, I have heard conversations where alcohol and its failure of prohibition, right? It's sort of interesting that the only amendment we've ever passed where you said you can't do a thing. All of our amendments from 1 to 27 say, here's the thing you can do that's protected, except alcohol. And it's the one we said, yeah, we're undoing that one. I think that's where it says, like, look, the one time we tried pure prohibition legally on anything, we undid it at the nation level. Why do we treat alcohol differently? I think because there's just a longer culture and history. I mean, you drank alcohol in medieval times because it was safer than the water, all right? And there's not a lot of, there are American drugs like ayahuasca, peyote, but the immigrant culture of Europeans who settle over here, they have the culture of alcohol consumption going back centuries, millennia. There's not the centuries and millennia. Like, you needed chemicals to make cocaine. It can only be made in the 20th century. You couldn't make cocaine or heroin in the 1500s. You could smoke marijuana because that's just dry it out, cut it up, and treat it like tobacco. So I think that's partly why too. Is just there's sort of a longer history of alcohol consumption around the world than there is of drug consumption necessarily, at least on a large scale.
Yes, okay, last question.
Yes.
What about our mental health system and the breakdown that we have in care for mental health? Because so much of drug addiction comes, it's one way or the other.
Yeah.
Either it causes it or it's a result of mental health issues.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of the efforts at rehabilitation are saying, like, don't stop spending money. Just put it to those resources like mental health treatment. Providing homes for the homeless so that they're you can get them on their feet and they don't feel the need to turn to these kinds of extracurriculars. I think I don't know if it's going to lead to that route for policy, but that's certainly what some advocates for change are saying is not that we need to accept all drugs, but our efforts at controlling and reducing its demand is in better infrastructure on the public health side. So when we talk about public safety or public health, I think that's where that conversation is sort of operating.
Well, with that, I would like for all of us to thank Dr. Colin. Hope you all found it very informative and entertaining. And join us next Wednesday, February 2nd, when I will be speaking again, this time on global demographics and changing demographics. And hope to see you all then. And again, thank you to Professor Snyder.
Thank you.